Thank you for that terrific welcome. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm glad you're all here this afternoon. Arkansas is not quite home, but my parents are from Tennessee. My dad's from West Tennessee, a little place called Mickey, which no one has probably heard of here because I think there are only 46 people that live there. But it's not so far away, actually, across the Tennessee border. And his mom, my grandmother, was a teacher who actually went to the state legislature to lobby for, successfully, a school for their community. And they had one school. And that's where my dad went from elementary through the end of high school. So today I want to talk with you about early childhood education in Arkansas and whether I can help you persuade your fellow citizens to take the road less traveled to high quality. And I hope by the time I'm finished, you'll understand exactly what I mean by that and be persuaded that indeed you should. Arkansas ranks 48 out of the 50 states for family income. Nearly 3 of 10 of your young children are in poverty. 6 out of 10 are in low-income households. And I think the case for early education in Arkansas is based on the economy. And I think I'm in a very appropriate place to say it's the economy. And I'll let President Clinton finish that one. Why do I say that? Well, early education, and I don't mean just preschool, which is my focus here today, but investments in learning and development for young children, beginning with high-quality prenatal care, continuing through home visiting programs that support families, and preschool into kindergarten, set a foundation for children that is remarkably determinant of their later success or failure. Most of the problems that we worry about and that affect the state budget and that I think determine the economic future of a community or a state are set in place before a child ever gets to the kindergarten door. So if we take a look at this slide, this is from a kindergarten class of 1998. You could show exactly the same thing, unfortunately, for the kindergarten class of 2010. And these are reading, math, general knowledge scores of children by income at kindergarten entry. And that little dotted line across the top, I've just set that there. That's where the top 20% by income, not by ability, but by income score. And so what I've shown you is how far everyone else is from that. And you can see the bottom 20%, they're pretty far away. But kids in the middle 20% are as far away from that top 20 as children in poverty are from them. Right? So across that entire distribution, there is a lot of lost developmental potential before a child ever starts kindergarten. And if we look at, this is an index of a dozen different social and emotional skills, includes self-regulation, That's very important. It's the ability to pay attention to things that somebody else wants me to pay attention to. That's important for learning how to read. It's important for staying out of trouble with the law. It's important for getting a good rating at your job. Right? And you can see that we see the same kind of relationship. Big gap for children in poverty, but that gap continues well through the income distribution. And remember, you're 48 out of 50 states. So Arkansas as a whole is not up there at the middle. It's down toward the bottom. Well, that's a problem. What do we do about it? Well, I'm going to talk about some specific preschool studies that I worked on, but that's a way of really, from my perspective, illustrating what we know. The way to talk about what we know from a scientific perspective is to summarize all the evidence. And state of the art for doing that today is what's called a meta-analysis, which is a fancy way of saying we've mathematically summarized the evidence. Right? So when we do that for preschool studies, and we've done that at our institute for 123 studies since 1960. This just focuses on the cognitive side of development, but we've done the same for social and emotional development. And 3 different color bars, right? The first one shows you average effects across all studies at 3 different time periods. The end of the program, typically kindergarten entry, ages 5 to 10, and then beyond age 10. And in some studies, as I'll show you, that's as late as age 40. The blue bar says, well, what if we only looked at high-quality research designs like randomized trials? Does that give us a different answer? The answer is yes, and it tells us that effects are bigger than in poor-quality studies. And then the red bar says, well, what if programs looked more like highly effective programs than just average? What would the effects be? These are reported in standardized effect sizes. That's another one of those fancy technical terms. But essentially what it means is they're rated on a scale from 0 to 1, and you can think of 1 as the achievement gap. So this is a fraction of the achievement gap, and that big red bar says that if we have programs that are high quality, we can get effects that are large enough to close at kindergarten entry 90% of the achievement gap. And then if we look later on, you'll see it's more about half the achievement gap later on. And this pattern's consistent, right? So that one of the things that we've learned is if you want large, long-term effects, you have to have really big, short-term effects. So we learned a few other things about this, right? As I've said, if you want big effects, your initial gains have to be large. In addition to that, I talked about high-quality programs. What makes them high quality? Well, one thing that was clear looking across all of the evidence is a focus on intentional teaching. Right? And that focus is especially effective if it is individualized. We're not talking about large group direct instruction. We are talking about a focus on intentional teaching one-on-one and in small groups. A strong curriculum with specificity, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but essentially, children only learn what you teach them. That seems obvious, but then we seem to forget about them and leave out some of the things we want to learn, and then we're surprised that they didn't learn them. And finally, that effective preschool can be scaled up. These are not all small-scale hothouse studies. There are some very large-scale studies with very large impacts. I'm going to talk about one of them. The first study I'm going to talk about, though, is the study where I began. This is the study that first got me interested in early childhood. When I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, I discovered, as researchers do, much as Columbus discovered the New World, it was here, people knew about it, it was new to him. Perry Preschool was new to me in 1981, but it was started 20 years earlier in 1962, and actually my job was doing the age 19 follow-up and an economic analysis on that. It is a true randomized trial begun in the early 1960s, half-day preschool program, 3- and 4-year-olds, very intensive, one highly qualified teacher for every 6 children. I need not tell you this is not typical practice, all right? Weekly home visits with one-to-one tutoring. Contrary to what is often said about this and other studies, this was not teaching parents how to work with their kids. This was one-on-one tutoring with the children in their homes. It's a true randomized trial. Half the kids got it, half of them didn't. Which half got it was determined by lottery. They were followed up through age 40. They're working on the age 50 follow-up now. I actually hope to get re-involved again at the retirement study when they do the age 65 follow-up. I'm not that much older than the kids in the study. We call them kids, right? They're in their 50s. I guess the oldest cohort now is pushing 60. And very minimal attrition. So there are 123 kids identified at age 40 out of the original 128. And there's a benefit cost analysis that looks at, so what are the economic impacts of this, to go back to my economic message, and that's where I got started. But first, let's take a look at the cognitive effects. Remember that point, 90% of the achievement gap? Well, we have that right there at the very beginning on general cognitive abilities. And then if you look at reading and math later on, you'll see those effects are not nearly as large. They're about 1/3 to 40% of the achievement gap later on. And remember how intensive this program was. If we move forward to their school years, these kids were less likely to need special education. They had higher achievement test scores through 14, and indeed higher knowledge and skills on test scores even at age 19. And they're more likely to have graduated from high school on time, half versus 2/3. It is not uncommon for low-income minority children in communities of concentrated poverty to have 50% graduation rates. If you can move that from 50% to 2/3, that's a big deal. Right? Well, it wasn't just on education. They were less likely to get in trouble in their classrooms, beginning in elementary school, less likely to be involved in delinquency, and as adults, less likely to be arrested multiple times, less likely to be involved in a violent crime, less likely to be involved in a drug crime. And economic effects, they made more money, only a little bit more likely to be employed. In America today, if you want to survive, you need a job. And they're more likely to have a savings account. Now, we don't know if that's because they made more money for the last 20 years or because they learned to plan, do, review in preschool, and they continued that habit through their adult life. That's not just a joke, because that plan, do, review is, I believe, what also keeps them out of jail. Right? They're more likely to own their own home. They're more likely to have a second car. They are more prosperous. Now think about what it would be like if you did this for an entire community and not just for 60 kids. My job as an economist was to figure out what's the dollar value of all of these things. Right? And then to weigh it against the costs. It is not a complete accounting, because a complete accounting is ethical and moral and not just economic. Girls in this study were less likely to have an abortion. I can't put a dollar value on that. It is certainly a positive outcome. Right? Staying out of jail, as you can see, criminal justice system costs is the biggest benefit. Right? So from an economic perspective, that's really important. It does not capture the value to the people who stayed out of jail and their families. Right? So I look at this as an estimate of the lower bound of the value of the program. Now, that's nice for 60-something kids in southeastern Michigan, but what about on a larger scale? Well, Chicago Child Parent Centers in Chicago started up a couple of decades later, were provided to thousands of kids in the city of Chicago. Were not as intensive, right? So they had two teachers, a teacher and an assistant for every 18 kids. But it's operated by the public schools of Chicago. Teachers are paid public school scale. Maximum class size was 18. And you see all of the same impacts. Increased high school graduation, decreased special education, decreased grade repetition, decreased arrests of juveniles, but they're all smaller. Well, this is a kind of dose-response relationship we might expect. You provide the same experience, less intensive, you get the same kinds of results, less intensive. Well, again, from an economic perspective, what does this mean? Well, Perry Preschool produced benefits of almost $300,000 per child from a not insubstantial $18,000 per child investment. That's 16 to 1. That's net present value. That means I didn't just add up these numbers. I took into account you could have invested this in the private sector, got a good return, and what I've done is subtract that out and said this is what would be left over above the value of the private sector investment. And in Chicago, a much smaller investment, about $8,000 per kid, benefits are still 10 times the cost. Notice, this is not even close. There is a lot of room for error here. We could be off an order of magnitude. So when we talk orders of magnitude, we're now talking about the kinds of differences that astronomers talk about in terms of error. We can be that wrong, and these preschool programs are still a good economic investment. Well, all right, so that's a big picture, a general picture, but what about Arkansas? Well, I want to give you the results of a recent simulation that we did, not for Arkansas, but for the country as a whole, but I think of particular importance to Arkansas, where we asked the question, using national data on children at kindergarten entry and national data on on where kids go to preschools now and the quality of those, if we provided high-quality, full-day preschool to every child in America, what would that do to achievement gaps? And so here are achievement gaps for African American versus white non-Hispanic students at kindergarten entry: about 9 months in mathematics, about 7 months in reading. Right. Universal pre-K of high quality would reduce that to about 5 months in math and 0 in reading. Right. Think about what that change would mean. And if we look at Hispanics, larger gaps and even larger reductions. Right. So down to 2 months in math and essentially 0 in reading. Right? So we could take the gaps by race and ethnicity in reading essentially down to 0 at kindergarten entry. If we look at the gaps by income, you'll see they're pretty big. Essentially, low-income kids start a year behind their higher-income peers. Universal pre-K wouldn't reduce this nearly as much as it would reduce the gaps by race, but still substantial. Right? So preschool is not magic. Kids are still poor after they go to preschool. But it can have a remarkable impact, especially on racial inequality in where kids start out kindergarten. And remember, those gaps are not closed. Right? The fact of the matter is, most of the gap at high school exit between blacks and whites, between Hispanics and whites, is that gap you saw at the kindergarten door. And we can close that, essentially, with the right policy in reading. Now, I want to give you another example from my state of New Jersey, my adopted state. I've been there 25 years. As a result of a court decision in a case called Abbott versus Burke, which was about educational adequacy, our state Supreme Court ordered high-quality preschool education beginning at age 3 for every child in 31 cities and communities with high concentrations of poverty. It's about where a quarter of the children in New Jersey live. Above 90% of the minority children in New Jersey live in these communities. And the state has, in fact, implemented this program. They have done it with high expectations, with adequate funding, with strong leaders, small classes, maximum class size is 15. It's 2 years, it begins at age 3. And there are other supports for children and families. I'm going to talk some about those. Among the most important of those other supports is that there is a continuous improvement cycle. Remember I talked about the importance of plan, do, review? It's not just important for preschoolers and for staying out of trouble or doing well on your job in the private sector. It's important for ensuring that when you put a lot of resources into a public program, you get the intended results. And so we developed, when I said high expectations, those are in state standards. And so we created those. We then every year measured and assessed our progress on those. We took that information, we analyzed and planned at every level, from the teacher in the individual classroom to the district to the state. And then we implemented professional development and technical assistance based on that, and then we repeated. Now, I call this a GPS, this continuous improvement system, a GPS for quality. Right? A GPS tells us where we are, and it gives us step-by-step directions how to get where we want to go. Right? So, we created preschool program guidelines and code that set high expectations, preschool teaching and learning standards that set high expectations for what teachers should do to enable children to meet the high expectations for their learning and development. We put in place rigorous curriculum, strongly supported, that aligned with those expectations for what children should learn and teachers should do. And we had aligned assessments at every level, district, classroom, and child, for not just accountability purposes, but to provide the guidance in the GPS. Right? It tells us where we are, and that information is then used to figure out how do we get to our goals. And professional development at every level is driven by these data. So what happened? 2000 is where we started. The vast majority of these kids, 70%, were already in preschool and childcare programs. Even after we had brought new resources in, those blue bars tell you where we are on a scale that runs from poor to minimal. If you're below minimal, I think you have to worry you're hurting kids, not helping them. To good to excellent. And I think good to excellent is where the action in terms of improving children's learning development really happens. And you can see the vast majority of the programs these kids went to were less than good. By 2008, that had shifted, right? So the entire distribution has been moved. And these are, by and large, the same teachers. Right? We sent them to school, we doubled their salaries if they got a degree and certification, and we gave them individualized coaching on not how to be a better teacher, but how to improve my practice with my classroom today. Well, what were the impacts on kids? Well, so these are the impacts on literacy. And you can see this same pattern you saw in the Perry Preschool, right? Big at the beginning, moving down over time, but they do not disappear. So these are the state standardized tests, language, arts, and literacy. If you want to, again, think about this as percentages of the achievement gap, we're closing 10 to 25% of the achievement gap with this program, long term. And we're actually doing a better job in math than with literacy. And in a world where STEM is really one of the keys to high-skill, well-paid jobs, this is incredibly important. Right? Remember, these are kids, all of whom live in urban or rural communities with high concentrations of poverty. Grade retention and special education. The percentage of kids that by 5th grade have failed and repeated at least one grade, almost 20%. That's reduced to 12%. Percentage of kids in special education reduced from 17 to 12%. Right? It's not miraculous. It does not prevent every kid from having a problem. But these are big changes system-wide in the experiences of students, in the cost to the educational system. So, to be more specific now about, so what do we make from this for Arkansas? Well, Arkansas in early childhood starts with a lot of advantages. You have strong leaders and strong capacity in early education in your state. You do have high standards for learning. You have a full-day program in ABC and the ability to serve 3-year-olds. This is not typically the case in the U.S. Most state pre-K programs do not enroll 3-year-olds at all. There is attention to curriculum, extensive collection and use of data, evidence of teaching quality and effectiveness. My involvement with early childhood in Arkansas actually goes back a decade, right? So our institute has conducted studies of your program going back to 2005, and kids who went to preschool, who went to ABC in the 2005-2006 year had substantial gains, literacy, language, and math at kindergarten entry, and those persisted at some level through at least 3rd grade. Now, those gains are probably about half as large as we would like initially. And the long-term gains through third grade are pretty small as a result. You also have a federal expansion grant right now that provides an extra $15 million a year to develop especially high quality and expand enrollment. Now, what does Arkansas need? Well, the first thing Arkansas needs is to build public will, right? I think because Arkansas in the past has been successful, the state's perhaps become a little too complacent about early childhood. And I think the state has a real need to build public will. Demand from parents, demand from business, philanthropy, and the general public to take this program from good to great. Because that's not going to be easy. It's going to take resources, commitment, and time. There needs to be a bigger emphasis on plan, do, review. The state collects a lot of data, but the GPS for quality as a system, I do not think is quite there. Right? We need a systemic version of the Good to Great program that's been done in a couple of communities here. We need more focus on curriculum and its implementation. It is not enough to point programs to what are good curricula. First, that changes over time, and you need to keep pointing them to what's new. But they also need a lot of support to make sure they actually implement those curricula as intended. Every teacher needs to be well qualified. Preschool teachers are not all required to have a four-year college degree. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine issued a recent report saying not just every teacher of a preschooler, but every teacher of a child under 5 ought to have a four-year degree with specialized training. And they need to be adequately paid. Frankly, it doesn't matter what qualifications you require of preschool teachers if they're paid $10,000 to $30,000 less than a kindergarten, first, or second grade teacher. Expanded access. Eventually, every child needs to have the opportunity for these kinds of programs. Right? And talk about what that is. I used as an example the New Jersey program, where virtually all kids go to these programs beginning at age 3. In Union City, New Jersey, just a couple of weeks ago, they had a story in the New York Times because someone looked at data nationally on every school district in the country. And one of the school districts that stood out for high performance was Union City, New Jersey. It is one of those 31 communities where virtually every child qualifies for free and reduced lunch. The vast majority of them come from homes where English is not the first language. And they are scoring a third above the national average on National Assessment for Educational Progress. Now that's remarkable. Every school district in the United States can do the same thing. Now, we're not all going to be a third above average then, right? But our average is going to be a lot higher. And finally, and this again ties into my example of Union City, preschool needs to be the leading edge of reform. Right? If you do these things that I talked about, and when I talked about this in one community, Vineland, New Jersey, a member of the school board raised her hand and said, "But if we do this, everyone will move here." And my response was yes. I didn't add, "That's not the problem you have now." So Preschool is the leading edge of reform. In Union City, New Jersey, they used to teach algebra in 9th grade. They now teach algebra in 7th grade. Right? This is not hot-housing kids. This is not pressuring kids. This is recognizing that kids no longer enter kindergarten 18 months behind. And kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, all the way on up need to change, and you need to reform them all the way up. They've done this. That's why they have a community that, if you look at national data, you can identify because how far above usual practice, usual outcomes they stand. I think school districts need to be the hub to make this happen. We have to link early childhood programs with the public schools, with K through 12 and beyond, if they're really to be the leading edge of reform. And frankly, I think to get the resources required, financial and otherwise, they need to be linked to the public schools. Does that mean every preschool program has to be in a public school? No. Right? In New Jersey, 2/3 of the providers are private, contracting with the public schools. But you know, if you don't meet high expectations, you're fired and they contract with somebody else. We simply do. So why is there no low quality? It is simply not allowed to exist. And a public-private partnership can do that. Okay, so I began with the image of the road less traveled, and that comes from the poet Robert Frost. I do believe, as Frost believed, that if we take the road less traveled in early childhood, that will make all the difference. And I'm inviting you to start down that road today, because if you do, right, eventually, right, every child in Arkansas will start school better prepared, will have a stronger economic future, and indeed the future of the entire state is going to be stronger. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. If anyone, we have a microphone, so feel free to raise your hands. Any questions? Shirley, there's one right there. Familiar face.
Hi.
Hi.
The data that you presented is astounding in terms of the benefits to a state or a community. And I'm wondering, and you can include Arkansas in your answer, but across the nation where there is some pre-K, what are you finding is the pushback or the reasons, besides somebody saying we don't have enough money, for states and communities not making this investment?
Well, the number one reason people give is we don't have the money. My reaction is much the same as someone who says, I don't have the money to fix the windows in my house, to put in a new furnace, because my heating bills are so high, they're eating up all the money I have. You'll never, unless you accept that you're going to have to change that, you won't ever have the money. But I think the other thing that people say is government can't do this. Sure, in small programs like the Perry Preschool, they can do it. But if you look at the National Impact Study on Head Start back in 2000, where we looked at the results in 2010, they didn't produce these kind of long-term results. There are no long-term gains. Tennessee recently had a randomized trial and did not find long-term gains for their program. And it's a very pessimistic view of basically saying, government's simply not competent to pull this off. Well, that's why I began by saying, let's look at all the evidence. You can always find people who have failed. That doesn't mean others don't succeed. There are plenty of people who haven't run a 4-minute mile. That doesn't mean someone can't run a 4-minute mile. But we do have examples of large-scale programs that have produced long-term results. North Carolina is one of them. They have strong results through 3rd grade, and their results are stronger the more saturated a county is in the provision of high-quality pre-K. Right? The state of New Jersey has done it in these 31 communities. And to give credit where credit is due, the Bush administration looked at the results of the Head Start Impact Study and changed Head Start. And these changes have continued under the Obama administration. And if you look at data collected year by year on how much Head Start children learn, that has grown substantially since the Bush administration reforms. So, yes, government can fail. Government can also succeed, and this is why I emphasize this continuous improvement system. If we did not have that, if teachers were not doing self-assessments, if districts were not doing self-assessments, with the state looking over their shoulder, if higher education was not looking over the shoulder of the state, and this entire system holding everybody accountable and providing information on which people acted to continuously improve it, you would not have seen that shift from 2000 to 2008. And if you looked at 2015, you would see that we continued to move. Right? So you have to have, government failure is a real risk. You have to have this kind of continuous improvement, or GPS, in place to ensure that you get the results. But if you do, you can get them. And by the way, you don't have to recreate all of this. Right? The government of Bermuda came and visited New Jersey, went and saw our programs, wrote the New Jersey Department of Education and said, can we just have all of your materials, your standards, all of the tools that you give to teachers and districts for assessing children, assessing teachers, for self-assessment, and that is now today the National Early Childhood Program in Bermuda.
By the way, for those who, the 1 or 2 people that may not have recognized the person who asked that question, this is the representative from Pine Bluff, Clinton School graduate from our first class, Representative Vivian Flowers, who next weekend for Catherine's graduation will be here to introduce President Clinton. Representative Flowers, always glad to have you back. Any other questions? Yes, we got one back here. We got a couple on this table right here.
Mr. Barnett, thank you for being here and informing us in a very friendly manner, but informative. I don't care for statistics as a rule, but yours were very palatable. I have a question regarding professional development. Were you able in your role to see, were there any particular areas at the beginning of the New Jersey project where there was a whole lot of professional development needed, maybe for math, for social behaviors, early reading skills? And would that have changed over the years that the universal pre-K programs have been in effect? Have the topics for professional development for the teachers remained the same from start to currently?
Well, so your questions are right on target. In fact, there was substantial change over time. One of the things that I think is important is that there are a very small number of curricula that are approved by the state. And programs within a single district all have to use the same curriculum. And professional development within a district is curriculum specific, right? So that it's not general. It is in fact about the curriculum that you are doing. Very early on, we saw that we were doing pretty well in language and literacy, and kids' scores were moving up in language and literacy. And with respect to mathematics, we did not see any change at all in kids' scores at kindergarten entry. And when we looked in the classrooms, we saw teachers just weren't doing math, period. Well, you put those two pieces of information together, you have your marching orders on professional development, and statewide, we focused on math for several years. We also had to have specialized professional development on coaching. Right? Our coaches are called master teachers. We took them out of the classrooms as our best and most knowledgeable teachers, but that doesn't mean they know how to teach other teachers. Right? So there had to be coaching about that. As the program has moved along, the nature of the coaching has moved with it. So we started with relatively easy measures because there was a lot to do. We started at a very low level. We now have to use different measures to assess the classrooms because basically they're topping out on the old ones. So we've upped the requirements. So we now have much more difficult assessments, observations of the classrooms that go deeper. And at some point, we will probably have to shift yet again.
I think we have another question back here. Did someone else have their hand up? Yes.
I dare say that probably everybody in this room is on board with the importance of early childhood education. And I'm really pleased that we have a couple of our elected officials here. So my question to you is, what's a strategy that you use to reach out to your elected officials? They can't do it by themselves, the few that we have here. So just a strategy, how do we get their attention? And
well, I think this is a wonderful place to ask that question. And I may not be the most appropriate person to ask, since I'm an economist who is not from Arkansas. I have based on my own personal experiences, I think the first thing that you have to do is basically run a campaign. Building public will requires essentially the same kind of campaign you would run to get somebody elected, although in this case you're trying to elect high quality early education. Because people as a whole do not understand the difference between what they have and high quality. People don't understand, if they don't have it, that it's connected to current state policies and how it's connected. They don't understand necessarily the connection to the economy or the role that preschool can play as the leading edge of P20 reform that will lead Arkansas to being a state with a workforce that is high skill and high paid. Right? That's a lot of information that you need people to absorb. And it takes an extensive campaign to make that happen.
One more question.
Yeah, just quickly, there is a campaign to do that, and if anybody wants to be part of that campaign, you should feel free to call Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. Catherine Hazlett's our Education Policy Director, and our website is aradvocates.org, so you can find our contact information there, and we would love to have you be part of the campaign.
What's that? What was that? I know it. Well, first of all, Steve, thank you for coming. Rich, thank you for your promotion of Arkansas Advocates. I think that's a great organization. There's been no organization over the last several years that have done more to stand up for children and families than yours, and I think we do owe you a round of applause for that. And for those of you that want to ask Steve if any further questions, please come up and visit after the program. Thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful weekend.